Okay, now we want to move on to network communications. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some of the ways that we communicate via network. Okay, this might be some PLC communications, FTP, TCP/IP. We're going to actually understand the basics on client-server communication. In particular, this has to go with TCP/IP. And then this is my favorite lab. This is where we're going to take information from our system and spit it out into hyperterminal via TCP/IP. So anytime that I start messing with the outside world, that's when I get excited, because now we know it's not smoke and mirrors anymore. So what is networking used for? Well, for data. I mean, the fact that if we want to send a robot where it found something, or the measurement of our part, it's for data transfer. It can also be for control, turning the system online, turning it offline, saving programs, loading programs, or it can also just be for image, okay? Whether it be for image viewing, we've already been seeing that. I mean, the fact that we're connected onto our camera, that's all via network, or for saving images, because we might want to save them later, record, playback. We're also going to understand about the WriteMageFTP function. So who can communicate? Well, Insight can communicate to another Insight, can communicate to a PC, it can communicate to PLC. The truth is, it can communicate to any other device that uses the same protocol as itself. And we have a whole range of protocols. We've got all the different PLC type ways that we can communicate, and then we also have all the information like using ActiveX controls, OPC, serial communication, all different kinds of ways that we can communicate. So when we're doing PLC, a lot of people said, why don't you do PLCs in class? Well, two reasons we stay away from that. One, we do not want to become a PLC trainers. That starts going in whole other directions. And two, almost all of the work is done on the PLC. Very little is actually done on Insight. It's a matter of, where do we put our effort? Now, on your desktops, there should be an IS student folder, and inside the IS student folder, there are some tutorials. One of the tutorials is about communicating in the spreadsheets with EIP, and we use Rockwell Control Logics PLC to show the demo. We also have in that folder a communication with Siemens, the S7 PLC, how you do it with Profinet. So both of those tutorials are there. They're only based on spreadsheet. Most of it's going to be done behind the scenes. It's getting the two connected to each other so they start communicating, and then just putting the information in registries or tables or however that particular PLC communicates. We also do the MC protocol, which is your MilSec. This is your Mitsubishi. So we also can communicate via Mitsubishi PLCs. And then there was the SIP-Sync. So we also do SIP-Sync as well. It's just basically some type of chronological thing that the whole line uses. Oh, and also those tutorials are also available online as well. So with that said, let's talk a little bit about client-server communication. So this is your TCP/IP. I like to call TCP/IP the ASCII of network communication. Okay? It's just basically sending ASCII information back and forth. So it's just really your basic network communication. You know that you're communicating there. Now, who can do TCP/IP? Well, an Ethernet I/O module, a PC, PLC of PC running Visual Basic, another Insight. So there's a whole ton of different equipment out there that just does TCP/IP. Now, TCP/IP actually uses client-server communication. It's going to require an IP address. So each one needs to have a unique IP address on the network so that it knows who it's communicating with. If you're ever having problems with network communication, I suggest that you roll the system in your PC back to Microsoft's default one of 192.168.0 and some number, just to do some troubleshooting. Just to sit there and say, okay, is my PC and my camera communicating with each other? You know, off the network and everything, they at least can communicate. Okay, so I know that's set up. Now when I put it out to our corporate network, so let's say I change it to 10.10.85. some number, all of a sudden it doesn't work there. Then you need to start talking to the IT department and say, what are the ports that you're blocking on me? Why am I not able to get onto your network? Because they're managing their network. All Windows operating systems have what it takes to manage this network. So that's why you can just pull it on its own just to do some troubleshooting. Now we can handle two different types of network communication. We can do DHCP and we can do static. So your DHCP is having some type of server assign your IP address, or you can go in there and assign the IP address itself. Which one do you think we'd rather you use? Static. Why? More reliable, it doesn't change the IP address. DHCP servers, it depends on how it's set up. And so when you power down, it might give your IP address to someone else. So when you power back up again, if you have a domain name server, that's fine. It'll find it again. But if you're not using a domain name server, now all of a sudden you're not connected to your camera anymore. So by having a static IP address, it makes it easy that you can connect to it. Now be careful. If you're using a DHCP server, a lot of DHCP servers, you can basically say in the table, don't assign these IP addresses. These are going to be static ones that I'm going to be assigning. Now, it means you have to control your static one, but it prevents the DHCP server from trying to assign in that range. So you might want to set up a range that's what your insights are on, and then let them do your PCs however you want. Now, there's also this concept of subnet. Now, for some of you guys who might be IT geeks, I know there's more behind subnet than this. But the easy way to remember subnets is any place that you have a 255 there. It means that IP address octet needs to be the exact same. It needs to be what that number is. So for 192.168.0 network for Microsoft, the default subnet mask is 255.255.255.0, which basically means that last number is allowed to change. The first three are not. They need to be all the same. Now, I do caution you. You could be using 192.168.0 and some number, and maybe one PC has a subnet mask of 255.255.0.0, and another one has 255.255.255.0. Now, you might say, well, I'm not changing that third number, so isn't that the same? No. Subnet mask is what's saying what subnet is on. So even though you're not changing that third number, the fact that you only have two 255s and two zeros is very different than the three 255s and 1 0. Now let's say that you have your system sitting down on the floor, not on the same subnet, because maybe the floor is 10.10 and you're 10.15, because the company's just split it up that way. So you're sitting there going, but I should be able to get to that camera. I don't see it in my list. How do I get to that camera? Well, first thing you want to make sure you can ping it. So in a command prompt, type ping and the IP address. And if you get a ping coming back, hopefully that's your camera, that means there is at least a physical connection there. If there is not a physical connection there, this won't work. So you at least have to have your physical connection. So as soon as you're pinging it, you're like, OK, I've got that physical connection. Then you're going to go underneath System, Explore Host Table, and you can actually write in the name, and what's most important is that IP address of that system you're trying to get to. This will allow for you to go over routers and connect to that system. So what's going to appear inside your network list is a little icon for that camera. And so now you're going to be able to connect to it. Just double click, just as you would any of the other cameras, and it's going to connect to it. Now what happens if someone changes the IP address on that camera? You won't connect. It'll say that connection was not able to be made and everything. You'll still see it on your list. This is one of the reasons that we like static IP addresses, so that you don't have to be changing it, because it's just a static point in your list. That's all that it's doing. It's allowing you to have that gateway to connect over to the unit. Now, when we're dealing with TCP/IP, like I said, it's client-server. So what does that mean? That means that we have a point-to-point communication. You've got two people, and they're going to connect to each other. Now, the main difference between the client and the server is that the client is responsible for opening the port. They can send and receive from each other, but as far as the differences between them, the client opens the port. Server just waits for the port to be opened. Now, there's a couple of different functions we can do with it. We have a write device, and guess what write device does? It writes. Guess what read device does? It reads. And guess what TCP device does? TCP device is that connection. That is the one that's telling it who is the client, who is the server, what IP address you're on, what port you're going to be on, and how long you want to wait for your server to listen to you. Anytime you're doing TCP/IP communication on Insight, you have to start with a TCP device. Have to start with it. Insight can be client or server. We can do both. And also, when we are a client, remember I said that the client's responsible for turning the system online or for making the connection. Insight will make the connection when it first goes online and every time it writes. So if I'm the client and I'm Insight, I will make sure the port is open when I go online and every time I write. So what we want to do is we want to take some information and send it from one camera to another. So we're going to say the camera on the left is the client and the camera on the right is the server. So if I am the client, think of it like a telephone. If I want to connect to someone, I need to put the IP address of the server in. So I need to put in that phone number of the person I'm calling. I need to say what port I'm going to use. The protocol will always be TCP/IP. And then you have these control characters at the end. So by default, it's carriage return and line feed. So it says after every statement I send, I'm automatically going to append a carriage return and line feed for it, so I know that my statement is done. And then it also has a timeout. It's how long it will wait to make sure it has established communication with the server. Now, if I am the server, once again, think of a phone. The server does not put anything down for the IP address. That's because it has the phone and it's waiting for someone to call them. So pretend that you do not have caller ID, so as soon as the phone rings, you're going to pick it up, okay, and you're going to connect to the person. So you're going to leave your IP address blank. You're going to make sure you have the same port number as the client because you're communicating on that port. Your protocol will still be TCP/IP. Your end characters still should be carriage return line feed. And the timeout is ignored because the timeout is only on the client side trying to make the communication. On the server side, it just waits for someone to call it. As soon as you call it, boom, it's good to go. So we inserted some auto-inserted functions into there to kind of remind people the flow of communication. Because when we first started with network communication, what would happen is we have a camera that's set up as the client, we have a camera set up as the server. And the server's writing information to the client. Well, is that allowed? Yeah, sure. They can write back and forth together. We don't care. So the server can write to the client. That's great. So what would happen is they would come online, they'd start talking to each other, telling all the information. All of a sudden, my server would go down. Come back up again, no communication. Why not? When are the 2 times that we open ports? Online, not power up. Online, write, not acquisition, write. So since my client is never writing back to my server, the port's never kept open. So as soon as the server went down, closed the port, opened, and then came back up, the client never knew to open it back up again. So there are some ways around it. I mean, you can send heartbeats over and everything. But we have these auto-inserted functions to kind of remind you of it. Okay, just to kind of, oh yeah, that's right, I've got to make sure that stays open. So if I am the client, so I set it up and I put an IP address in for my host and everything, the auto-inserted function is it will give me a write device, and then it will give me this test string. So that every single time that it goes to go, it's going to write out test string. Now I can go in there and change test string to be some format string and put whatever data I want in it. Beautiful. But this is reminding me that when I'm the client, usually I write. Don't have to, but usually I write. If I'm the server, so therefore I've left my IP address blank, the auto-inserted function is just going to be a read device. So that's where the information is going to come into when my client sends it to me. I can still do a write device for my server, send it back to my client, and I could still have a read device for my client on the same port. Okay, but it's just the definition of that first TCP/IP is who's actually the client, who's actually the server. For us to send information back and forth, both insights, if I'm using insights, have to be online. Because that's just our online-offline communication only happens when we're online. We can have multiple connections between multiple devices, but understand it's only point to point. If you guys are connected to me, we could use 3000. I could connect to you on 3001. You could connect to them on 3000, because you're not using 3000 yet. We might have been, but you're not. You need to have 1 port per camera that you're connecting to. We can do up to 12 connections. And you can be a client on one and a server on the other. The TCP device is what's defining the connection. If there's multiple people trying to connect to the server on the same port, it's whoever connects first. We can use any port, but we usually suggest that you use somewhere between like 3000 and 6000, because those tend to be user-assigned ports. When you start going lower, such as like port 21 or port 23 or port 505, those are already assigned to things. So like port 20 and 21 are FTP ports. Port 23 is Telnet port. Port 505, I want to say, is a Modbus port. So there are certain ports that already are assigned to certain things. So no, we don't want to mess with those. But usually between like 3000 and 6000, those tend to be the application specific. Now we also have the ability to write images out of the camera. Now you might say, well, isn't that what record was? Record required that you had Insight Explorer running. But what if you're on a situation where Insight Explorer is not running? Maybe on your PLC, that you're doing. So you don't even have PLC. You have Vision View running, but you don't have Insight Explorer running, because record and playback is all built into Insight Explorer. We can actually write out through an FTP server. As long as we can connect to an FTP server, we can write an image out, or just write text out. So when we're setting up the WriteMageFTP, the first thing it's going to ask for is what image? Usually A0. What's going to cause you to write? So with every acquisition, we could cause it to write. Then it's going to ask us what the host name is. So you need to either reference your PC, your emulator acting as an insight, that actually runs an FTP server behind the scenes, or put in the IP address of your third-party FTP server. Then you need to put in a username and password. So whatever your third-party username and password is, throw that in. If you're using our emulator, then the default is admin, lowercase, with no password. The next thing you're going to want to do is say what image you want to save. Usually it's A0, but there might be a reason that you might want to save a filtered image instead. Then the file name. Now they've changed this a bit in 4.9. I would say probably it fixed it, depending on which point you're looking at it from. Before 4.9, you could put in any path, and it would save it to that path. Now they fixed it where you can only go to a path that's at the FTP level or lower. This was for security issues that you shouldn't be able to just write willy-nilly to any place that that FTP server has access to. If you're writing from the Inside Explorer, it's going to be C, Program, Data, Cognix, Insight, Inside Explorer, whatever version you're using, emulator directory. That's where it's going to write it to. So you don't have any more options anymore. Sorry about that, guys. If you're using an FTP server, it's whatever the path that the FTP server has set. The append value, because whatever the name of the file is, it's just going to append a number to the end of it. When it reaches the end of it, goes back around. Trust me, 999 is not the highest value you could use. We just put that in there so that in case you add it on continuous and you quickly ran through it, you're only saving up to 1,000 images, not blowing your hard drive out of the water. Reset, please don't leave that set. If you leave that checked, you will never get past image 0. Data format, you can choose for it to be bitmap or JPEG. We discussed a little bit yesterday about why you would use one over the other. Screen capture. Screen capture came back in 4.8. Before that point, any unit that was Ethernet only, so did not have its own VGA port, so anything that was not a 2000 or a 3000 could not do screen capture. This was because the unit itself has no concept of display or graphics. It really doesn't. It's not till you get to the device that's showing it, Inside Explorer, Vision View, the ActiveX controller, or anything, until it starts bringing in the graphics. So when you're asking it to write from that point, it says, I don't know what to give you. But enough customers were like, but I want the image with the graphics on it at that time. So as of 4.8, they brought it back. So if you check it, you end up getting the bitmap image that's really going on underneath, but then they give you a secondary image that actually has the graphics overlay on it. A resolution. This is another one of those why you would choose something other than full. I have no idea. And then the final one is this disable FTP queuing. Now what this disable FTP queuing does is, let's say that I'm sending images out, because maybe I'm only sending bad images out. Now if I'm just getting that occasional bad image, no problem. Bad image pops up, saves out, line's still going. Now if all of a sudden something breaks, I'm doing image, 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 and it's going to slow down the system. Because now it's backing up with all these images, can't be doing the others. He's going to start dropping images, and it really slows down the system. So basically you're saying, hey, when I start queuing my images, don't. I will only save that image out. When I'm done saving, then I will grab the next image that I need to save out. I'm not queuing them behind, because think about it. This will normally hit when you have a bad part. Do you really need to know every single image that was taken of that bad process? No, in fact, you probably want to shut down the line, fix the issue, and then get going again. You don't need every single image from that. By just saying, yeah, at least I'll have a smattering from it. It will still allow for you to get that onesie, twosie kind of strange thing coming through. But otherwise, when a thing breaks, you're still not slowing it down. You can go and then take care of the situation and keep going. Like I said, if you're using Inside Explorer, you can reference your PC. That acts as an FTP server. And the information, once again, is being stored in this program data, Cognix, Insight, whichever version you're using, emulator directory. Let me also say, program data is a hidden file on Windows 7. So you're going to need to unhide that directory to be able to get underneath there. Now, we also have WriteFTP. So WriteFTP is meant to send text. Now, normally you're saying, well, Bonnie, why are we wasting our time on it? I get it. I mean, I definitely WriteImageFTP sounds great. Yeah, I could do WriteFTP. But what's so special about it? A lot of people don't know that there's a certain functionality built in to WriteFTP. So if I create a WriteFTP function, and then I put in who I'm connecting to, my password, my username, my name, the file name, leave it as HTML, and when it's asking for the string, leave the string blank. What's going to happen is I'm going to have this auto-inserted function that's going to give me my FTP. So this is my WriteFTP sitting here. It's It's going to give me some commenting, or I should say some formatting. It's going to give me the string that I'm writing out. So right now it just throws test string in, but we're going to be able to throw a format string in here. Then it's going to give me the name of the image coming out, and then it gives me a WriteMageFTP. Now you might say, what's the big deal on that? Well, if your boss has been telling you, you're not giving me enough information so I know what's going on, what you can do is write information out to an HTML page so that they can see the link to the image that you've just saved and whatever data you want to write next to it. So it's a nice way to kind of have a real quick report to see what's going on. If you really want to get cool, you can go to your visual web developer, find out what that formatting is to actually show the image outright, and put that formatting in there so that you can actually show the image inside your HTML page with whatever data you want to be placed over there. So some common issues. Being 10 years of tech support, these are some of the things that have happened. I am trying to send information out. Nothing's going through. Are you online? Oh, wow. Amazing how that works. Remember, we can't send or receive unless we're online. Secondly, username and password is case sensitive. Had someone call in and say, yeah, I've got admin in. I said, is it lowercase? No, it's uppercase. Did you change it? No. Then that's the problem, because by default, our admin is all lowercase. If the path is stated, and this isn't as a big deal anymore, but if the path is stated, you need to make sure the folder exists. We are not Windows. We will not create a folder for you. To control which images are written, best thing is to have some type of developing of the logic. So right now we have our global bit. What we could do is we could knot the global bit, tie it to the cell state of our WriteMageFTP, and so now we will only write when we have a bad image. Good images, don't even bother the system. And then finally, when you reach the max number, it will wrap around. Start overwriting the other images. What some people will do is they'll like append a date to it, or a date and time, and then in that case it'll always be a new image. But your choice, how you want to do things, it's up to you. So we talked about different ways to communicate with PLCs, that we can get some real-time communications with PLCs. I know I mentioned OPC and I don't show you a thing about it. We do have an OPC server, okay? And actually using OPC is extremely easy in Insight. It's just a matter of creating those tags and then bringing them over. Any of the cells inside Insight that you want to become an OPC tag, you just right-click on it. I think it's Insert Symbolic Tag. And one of the check marks inside that utility is use this OPC tag. And now all of a sudden on our OPC server, you'll see the tag show up. Device functions allow for asynchronous communication, meaning that it doesn't have to be tied to acquisition. It can be done on its own. The TCP is going to be where you define who is client, who is server, and what port you're on. Keep in mind that the client is responsible for opening the port. And then, oh yeah, by the way, I didn't mention this before. If you're writing data, unlike serial, write serial that you actually have to cast it to a string, and write device it automatically casts as a string. So you can bring actual data into it, but it will go out as a string. So at least that's one less step. And then finally, you have your FTP function so that you can write images out, or even just text data out to a file. And this is directly from the sensor, so you don't have to have Insight Explorer running. So now what I want to do is I want to do my application so that I'm going to send information out to Hyperterminal. So I'm going to pretend like Hyperterminal is going to be my robot, and I want to send the X, Y, and angle information coming back from my Find Patterns tool. I want to send that out. So I'm going to go on down to my program, add a little comment, because I'm a good little programmer, and I'm going to say send position data to Hyperterminal. Bless you. There we go. So since I'm going to do a TCP IP communication with Insight, what's the very first function I'm going to need to add? We talked about 3 of them. A TCP device function. Because remember that TCP device function is going to define whether we're client or server, what port we're on, and what our control characters are. So I'm going to go down to my input and output. I'm going to go underneath network. Now don't freak out when you see the network. There's a ton of network information. Got a ton of network commands. It's all alphabetical order. So what I wanted to look for is about midway down, there's going to be TCP device. I'm going to drag and drop that into my spreadsheet. So just give it a moment, puts it in there. And now what it's going to do is it's going to ask me for the host name. Now you need to know how the other device wants to communicate with you. Now hyperterminal can actually do either, but it prefers to be the client. So if hyperterminal is going to be the client, what does that make us? Makes us the server, exactly. So for the server, what do we put in for host name? Nothing. Exactly, we leave it blank. Now for a port number, I'm going to go ahead and leave it at 3000. That works for me. The protocol is TCP/IP. And my packet type, I'm going to keep it as carriage return and line feed. Beautiful. And the timeout is going to ignore it. Because since I'm making myself a server right now, it's just going to ignore whatever I have for my timeout. So as soon as I say OK, it's going to create my device, but then it also puts a read device next to it. Because remember we said those were those auto-inserted functions that are added to it. But I don't want to read, I want to write. So what I can do is, I don't need to get rid of the read, because if the client decided to send something to me, I could capture it. But instead, I'm just going to drop right below it, and I'm going to add a write device. So still over in my input and output inside my network area, I'm going to look for write device. And so the write device is just going to be a few down from my TCP device. Make sure you grab write device. So I'm going to grab that, drag, and drop it over. Now this is one of those times that I actually don't want to be typing down in my spreadsheet. I want to come up to here because it's going to reduce it to be in that one cell. The reason I'm doing this is I want to grab the cell next to it. If I'm typing down in that cell, I can never grab that cell next to it. So the first thing that my write device is going to ask for, so if I just kind of hover over it, it asks me for an event. So what event is going to have me write? What's the usual event we'd use for it? A0, exactly, A0. So with every acquisition, we want to write out. So I'm going to go reference A0. Beautiful. Put a comma there. Now if I hover over it, the next thing it's going to ask me for is what device. So it's asking you what TCP device is used. So now it knows when it's going to fire, but then it needs to know, well, who am I? Am I client? Am I server? Am I going to have to open a port? What port should I be on? So there's all these questions that it's kind of asking itself. So what I need to do is I need to reference down to where my device is, click on my device, and then do a comma. Okay? Now the rest of the information is data. So if I reference multiple cells, it's going to be concatenated together. But I don't want it to just be concatenated together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just choose the cell right next to write device. I know nothing's there yet, but I just know it happens to be the one right next to it. I'm going to take care of that in just 1 second. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK, and now I have my write device. If I were to run it right now, I would just see basically my cursor on the hyperterminal just go down the field, because it'd be sending a null string each time in a carriage return line feed. So it would just go down. You probably wouldn't even know that it's going down, and say la vie. So what I want to do is I want to send that data out. Remember, I was referencing E53 to send that data out. So I'm going to go ahead and put my cursor there right now so I know that that's the cell that I want to go into. And I'm going to go up to text, go into string, and there's going to be a really cool utility in here called format string. So if I drag and drop format string in here, it's going to help me start creating the string I want to send out. So the first thing it asks me is what my leading text is. So my leading text might say results. Or results. There we go. And that just means with every single string, it automatically is going to start with results and then give me what information I want. I can also say what my trailing text is. Okay? I'm not going to put any trailing text on there. But you might have to put like some type of leading character and trailing character on whatever you're sending. Okay. Now my terminators, I'm not going to set that. Did anyone catch why I'm not going to bother setting terminators here? Because they're already set inside the TCP device. Exactly. So if I were to add it here, I would see an extra jump on hyperterminal. But if I'm communicating insight to insight, it really causes havoc. Because basically you're wiping out the information in that cell. That's why I'm bringing it up so you guys are aware of where these things are. Now then I'm going to say add here. So I'm going to just press my add button and go up and choose my row, column, and angle coming back from my find patterns tool. So right now it gives me E12, F12, G12, which are the three that I chose here. But they have this label here. That's not going to help me. I might know what it is right now, but by tomorrow, forget it. Something shiny will come along, take my attention. I'll forget. So what I'm going to do is instead of having it say label here, I might say row. On the second one, I could say column. And then on the third one, I'm just going to say angle. That way I know what these are, okay? Because I'm never going to remember what the actual reference in my spreadsheet is. I just want to know what they are, so I quickly look at it. Oh, I'm sending out the row, column, and angle. Now what's happening at the bottom is it's building the string for you. So as you're adding things into it, it's putting them together. But do you see a problem with the string right now? There's no delimiter, exactly. It's concatenating everything together. So I don't know when one data stops and the other one starts. So what I can do is I can come up here to where it says use delimiter and check that. So I have my choice. I can do comma, space, tab, semicolon, or underscore. Or I could choose a single character. So if you guys are tweet masters, maybe you could do like a hash sign. So now I'm going to say standard. I'm just going to go back to standard, and I'm just going to leave the commas in. That works for me. Now what I can also do, like let's say I go to row. Do you see how it has this little include label? I can include the label into the string if I want. Maybe I might have to put a little space after it so that it looks better. Come on. So I can either choose to include label or not to include label, whatever works for me. I can also say what decimal places it is. So like maybe for my row, it's going to be 3. For my column, I can do 3. But maybe for my angle, I want 2. So notice it's building me my string at the bottom there. That's what's going to come out when I send information. Okay. So everything looks pretty good to me and everything. If I wanted to force it to be another data type, I could. If it needs to come out hex, if it needs to come out, do they even have binary, unsigned integer, whatever you need, it's there. I'm going to leave it as what the default is, so whenever I reference a cell, it knows what the default type is, and so it sets that. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and say OK, and what I should see is right next to it, see right next to my right, I have my results. So I'm almost there. I'm almost there. Now I need to set up hyperterminal. But before I set up hyperterminal, I need to know the IP address of my camera. So there's a couple of ways that I can get to it. One of the easiest ways is just to go up to Sensor, Network Settings, and it's going to give me what the IP address is of my camera. Please write down your IP address and not mine. Let me go ahead and say OK. Beautiful. So now I'm just going to minimize this right now because now I need to set up hyperterminal. Now, Microsoft, in their infinite wisdom, has decided that hyperterminal no longer needs to exist in Windows 7. Now, you can download, I believe there's the package from the website that's free, and it'll add hyperterminal as well as a couple of others there. We purposely didn't put these on the PCs because we wanted to have you guys feel the pain, so that when you all of a sudden had your PC and it doesn't have hyperterminal, that doesn't throw you off. You know that, oh, okay, right, default PCs don't have it. So what we did is we went to an XP implementation of it, and we grabbed the hyperterm.exe file. We tried to run it on Windows 7. It said, oh, you need this DLL. So we grabbed that DLL, tried it again. Oh, you need this DLL. Grab that other one. Then it stopped giving us a hard time. So if you take a look, you should have a folder sitting on your desktop that's called hyperterminal. And you should have at least 2 DLLs and your hyperterm.exe in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and double click on the exe file. And it says, do you want your terminal, because this is the first time I'm running it on this PC. So I'm going to say, yep, I want it to be my, hyperterminal to be my default telnet program. Yep. And so now it's going to come up and it's going to ask me, well, what do you want to name it? And so I'm going to name this TCPIP. Okay. Now, if I was an XP, I would have all these icons I could choose. Since I'm not in XP, there's no icons there. I'll get over it. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK here. Now, depending on yours might go through, depending on your laptop, it might go through and say, well, especially if you have serial ports, what's your dialing code, what's all this and everything. You might have to put some default in there just to give you a dialer. Mine, thankfully, didn't do that to me. Since I have no serial ports, you'll notice that it automatically goes to TCP/IP. It automatically goes to my host address and my port number. But if I had serial ports, it would go to the COM port first. So I would need to pull this down right here and get to the TCP/IP WinSock one. So as soon as I get to TCP/IP WinSock, it's going to ask me for the host address. So what do I put in for the host address? Yes, the IP address of the camera. You will want to put in the IP address of the server that it is talking to. So mine's going to be 192.168.0, and my last numbers are 144. Make sure you put in your numbers. Now, port number. What do I put for port number? 3000. If you ignore this, I will know. Now, if I say OK right now, and I start seeing a counting in the lower left corner, this is good. This means it has established communication with the camera. If there's no counting over there, that's a bad thing. Go back, check your IP address and everything, check what port numbers you have it on. For some reason, it's not connected correctly. Exactly, did not make that connection. So since it's counting, great, but why isn't it printing any data out? Because I'm not sending any, I'm not online. So now if I go back to Insight, and I go ahead and turn it on, so now data is being sent. If I look back over in my hyperterminal, data is being sent out of my hyperterminal. Isn't that pretty? Now I can move it. See? Move it around. Now watch what happens. Look what's happened here. What's up? Exactly. I'm sending pound errors right now. And the fact that I'm sending pound errors, remember we said pound errors are not known by third-party devices. So it's just not sending anything. Now if I put it back on, now it's back and running again. Now, I've realized as of, I think, 4.7, the connection between hyperterminal and Insight's much better than it used to be. I don't know if we did something better on our end or whatever. It used to be that if you set Insight offline, it automatically disconnected from hyperterminal. I only bring this up that if for some reason hyperterminal has to disconnect, right? It's just a matter of, for those who have not used hyperterminal, if all of a sudden it disconnects, right, and then all of a sudden you start trying to run it again, you see that you have a pound error here. And basically the pound error is saying, I am trying to send information out, but there's no one there to gather it. And this is because hyperterminal is not running. So right now it's disconnected. If I want to connect it, I just hit the call again, and now it's back to listening again.